Well, the 5% GDP target is really ambitious. Even last year, it was the opening year from COVID, and China achieved 5.2% mostly because of a rebound in consumption. But this year, we're not reopening again. And that means unless there are some ginormous infrastructure projects, China will find it very difficult to reach actually the 5%.
So then, Dan, what do you think it's going to take to do that? I mean, what steps do you think we're going to see the government rolling out in order to achieve that? Because, of course, they don't want to undershoot, because that wouldn't be a good look.
Well, I certainly understand the intention of setting up an economic target that's higher than the market expectation. The market confidence is quite fragile. It needs some good news. And the government seems to be quite determined and committed, and that's a good sign. But then when it comes to the actual spending, the fiscal deficit is only 3% this year. If we think about it, the GDP growth will be about 5% if it achieves the government target. And that means fiscal expenditure as a percentage of GDP will actually shrink. So mostly it's a contractionary rather than expansionary fiscal policy. So I think there has to be some sort of project that is in the similar size and quality of the Three Gorge Dam to really pull up the domestic demand. And so far, the housing market is still in contraction, and the hope for a housing market rebound is pretty much just gone. So that only left us with manufacturing and infrastructure.
Right. What do you make of the work report in terms of how China is addressing its long-term goals? Because we know that China doesn't really work with short-term targets as much when you have, 3, 5, 10, even 30-year plans. And we've heard a lot in terms of how they're looking to address certainly strategic sectors like EVs, AI, chips, healthcare, the elderly. And something we've been talking a lot about here at CNBC is the 4D factors, one of those being the demographics. So how do you think the work report sort of convinced the markets in terms of how they're looking certainly at these issues?
Well, this government has been amazingly consistent with its policy intentions. Even from 9 years ago, the main focus for the domestic reform is on the supply side. So in this conference, we still hear about the priority for energy security, food security, and supply chain security. And apparently, the government wants to direct more capital into these areas for good reason. And the domestic demand seems to be relatively still weak, given that people are more pessimistic about the job market perspective. But on the supply side, there are things to be optimistic. And China is going through this fast transition from a traditional energy-driven economy to this sort of green energy-driven economy. The whole EV industry that's along the new energy supply chain has been growing quite fast. Given the current growth rate, we can anticipate actually within 7 to 8 years, it can partially replace the hole that was left by the housing market contraction. But this process would require a lot more fiscal commitment and also a guaranteed overseas market. And that means the European Union have to be relatively open to China's entry. And at this point, it just seems more difficult.
Can I just really quickly ask you, considering the holes that are in the budget because of the land sales receipts being absolutely derisory, considering they're looking for that 5% increase when it does come to the growth target, they're looking for 3% CPI, should we have an expectation that even though it's perhaps not in anything that we got today, that there is going to have to be further stimulus in order to achieve these goals?
Well, the 3% of CPI target is even harder to be achieved because we have to be realistic. Inflation is ultimately a monetary phenomenon. If we're talking about a robust monetary policy, and that means we won't see more or drastic rate cuts in the coming months. And for China's CPI, it also heavily depends on food prices, of which 1/3 of the volatility is coming from pork. And so far, the pork prices is still going downhill. And for domestic demand to be firmed up, people's income have to increase a lot faster. So the job market has to improve. And that would give government a lot more pressure to create more productive projects. And that means local government have to be able to borrow more and issue more bonds.
And so, Dan, this is my follow-up to my initial question. Why have they stuck to the 3% fiscal deficit target when the market was expecting closer to a number of between 3.5% to 4%? If they have to invest in new projects for job creation, and they're also, by the way, talking about creating more job opportunities by exporting, or rather expanding the export of labor, how are they going to reach that mark with the same kind of issuance and with the same kind of spending plan?
I think the government has to stress its main point about maintaining the financial stability and also contain the local government's expectation. So the narrative since earlier last year was the responsible spending. For a lot of the local governments, they have faced difficulties in paying their own employees or supporting some of the local projects that have already started. So this year, if setting a higher deficit budget, that would give more leeway to the local government, but it can also create more speculation. So I think that means we will see more of the central government issuance of the bond and more of the debt burden being shifted to the central government rather than the local government. So it's a different allocation of the fiscal burden. To a certain extent, I think this is also can be considered as an improvement for the fiscal system rather than a setback.